think there are so many stories of all of these people claiming to have resolution with these dietary strategies that all essentially force your body into a fat burn.
The primary benefit is the lowering of chronically elevated insulin levels. People know processed food is horrible for you. If intermittent fasting is your favorite way of getting into a calorie deficit, there you go. But the problem is you will lose a certain amount of muscle mass. We know that. And the game becomes, how can I maximize fat loss and minimize muscle mass loss? What's the fastest ways to lower our insulin levels? Well, we just said it comes from how we eat. If I had cancer or any of my loved ones had cancer, you better believe they'd be fasting and they'd be prolonged fast. They'd be doing the flow protocol. Regular rounds of longer fasting, it's the most powerful intervention that we have. There's no drug or expensive therapy out there that comes close. And this is free. This is what we see in people and is probably the answer to the question, how come Jane can eat whatever the hell she wants and she seems to stay fit, and Bob over there looks at a muffin and he blows up? Are we looking for lasting weight loss? Are we looking for powerful results? The issue has never been weight loss. The issue is that.
All right, Dr. Jones, I'm going to take you on a quick blast of the past, okay? Do I have your permission?
Yes, sir.
About 2008, you were the fitness director, personal training manager of LA Fitness Yorba Linda. I was your, I think it was a TAM at the time, a training assistant manager. You know, ironically, after that career, some of the guys I listen to this day, like, what is it, Pedro Sculian? He's an LA Fitness guy, right? Back then, all about thermodynamics, conservation of mass, calories in versus calories out, eat breakfast like a king and dinner like a peasant because you don't want to go into conservation or hibernation mode, right? Remember all that? And then it was, for whatever reason, I know this. I was working at Harbor City, my biggest grand opening club at the time, and I was following John Berardi, and he challenged himself because no one believed him, right? This whole intermittent fasting thing wasn't real. It was just a craze. Dude gained 100 pounds on purpose, right? Just to lose it all via fasting, and looked incredible doing it. And I think that's when the whole world kind of sat back and said, whoa, right? What is this? There might be something to this timing thing. Now we flash forward 13 years and there's arguments on every side of the spectrum, pro, against, is it good, is it not? It's really just another form of weight loss. No, it affects your hormones. No, it actually affects longevity. And there's so much involved with all of this. But let's start with the basics of fasting and where you stand.
Okay, so God, I love that question. And where I stand in summary, emphatically regarding fasting, is that I'm not going to say it's mandatory because I want to be clear with literal claims, because apparently anything you say, even when you say it sarcastically or with implications behind it, people will take your words for literal interpretation. So I gotta always keep that in mind. But I think it is the strongest lifestyle intervention that we don't seem to agree on, and equally as powerful, which we're going to get into that in another time, another episode where we get into food. But the thing about food and why I talk about fasting more is because there's no argument there. People know processed food is horrible for you. So reducing your consumption of processed foods is tied with fasting. But I have to be specific. We're talking about, we're going to get into this, deep, weekly, long rounds of fasting. I would put up there with reducing consumption of processed foods. But reducing consumption of processed foods, no one's arguing that. No one's arguing for the preservation of consumption of processed food. So I spend a lot more time talking about the thing that is controversial and the thing that most people don't seem to, there's no consensus, right? Even with intermittent fasting, which is significantly more accepted nowadays, it's still not the standard. And you still have censorship and ideas against fasting, or fasting is dangerous. I mean, there's this documentary on Netflix. I'm blanking on the name, but they have an episode on these various holistic modalities, and they talk about fasting and the concerns and the dangers over it. And it blows my mind, because when you really get into it, for the problems that exist out there with our health and metabolic health, obesity, insulin resistance. This is one of the biggest categories out there. Regular rounds of longer fasting, it's the most powerful intervention that we have. There's no drug or expensive therapy out there that comes close. And this is free. This is free 99. Like, anybody can start today. And, it's that's equally as important to note because, it'd be one thing if the best therapy we had out there was $10,000. And I'm saying, this is it. Right. And I truthfully think that this would be worth paying $10,000 for. If you understood what I do in terms of what I've been seeing for the last 20 years. But the good news is I don't have to charge anybody $10,000 because they can fast on their own, and if they do that with my free information, then I know I'm doing my job right. And you guys know that we out there that we have various levels of coaching, and all that is just methods for you guys to have better access and better help implementing the information out there. But the information is free to the world, and that's what I want to continue to disseminate. So so to summarize my response, I'm full steam ahead with fasting done aggressively and done with the right pieces to go alongside with it.
Yeah, and let's dive into that because you have people who might want to dive into prolonged fasting. I'm probably that guy who would have back in the day. But obviously, there's a right way to do it. There's going to be a phase where some people might want to see how they respond, and I want to know what your definition of the right approach and methodology would be. If we're saying that prolonged fasting is the way to go, where does it actually start? And how do we implement
it? Great question. So let's just separate. So intermittent fasting, guys, is when we fast for it's a daily fast, right? So we take our eating window, we define our eating window from our first calories consumed, last calories consumed. That's an eating window. So each day is 24 hours, and your day can be broken down into your fasting window or your eating window. You add those two numbers together, that should equal 24 hours. And then you repeat the cycle 7 days a week. So sleep time is part of your fasting. Okay. So for intermittent fasting, the most popular method is the 16-8, right? So 16-8 refers to that 8-hour eating window, 16-hour fasting window. And you think about that, what most people are doing standardly right now is about a 10 to a 12-hour eating window, right? Breakfast at 7 in the morning and dinner, you finishing dinner around 7. So most people are already fasting for 12 hours. By the definition, technically speaking, you're not fasting for at least 4 to 6 hours after your last meal. But to keep things simple, we have that eating window and that fasting window. So all you're really doing to get to the 16-8 hour window is you're just compressing that 10 to 12 down to 8. So it's really not that big of a jump. And this is why I'm so much more aggressive with my recommendations beyond intermittent. I think intermittent is a piece of is important for a healthy lifestyle, your day to day. But I would argue 85% of us out there, we need something stronger. We need something more aggressive. And I think intermittent fasting is just the starting point. If you are very healthy, you have no insulin resistance, then you technically don't need fasting at all. You just need to get into a calorie deficit. So if intermittent fasting is your favorite way of getting into a calorie deficit, there you go. But the problem is most of us are not in that healthy, low inflammation state, which is why calories have yielded poor results, as proven by the data for decades. So and we can say that for another podcast, getting into the hormonal basis of obesity. But that's intermittent. So then we get into prolonged fasting. Prolonged fasting is anything that exceeds that 18-hour window. So we start looking at 20, 24 hours and more. So this is where we get out of the daily framework and we start looking into weekly because you can't, you can only fast 24 hours or longer, theoretically once, twice, maybe at the most 3 times in the week, depending on how long the fast is. And, for us with the flow protocol, I break it down into 3 stages. I break down that intermittent that we just talked about. Stage 1 is 24 hours. So for our patients, we get them into 24-hour fasts while they're still intermittent fasting on the other days. And look at, I mean, that's already semi-aggressive. That's already a big leap for a lot of people to do 2 whole 24-hour fasts in addition to your intermittent fasting the other day.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll do good for a lot of people out there. But again, are we looking for lasting weight loss? Are we looking for powerful results? The issue has never been weight loss. The issue is that weight maintenance resistance, which is my summary to obesity and all these other health issues that affect a person's weight. If you can really look at all those issues with regard to weight and summarize it as 3 words: weight maintenance resistance. And so there's this resistance to maintaining your weight. And those are the driving factors, whether it's obesity, insulin resistance, PCOS, menopause, all that. So the way that we can improve weight maintenance resistance is by healing the body more. And this is where I push people into the flow stage, that flow protocol. And if this is your first time, you guys, hearing about flow, this is the program that I created. So flow stands for fasting like our ancestors. I created structure where structure was missing in the world of prolonged fasting. So the flow protocol really embodies this ancestral wisdom. And so we get our patients into a 36, 48-hour fasting every single week. So in essence, what I have found over the last 20 years, 48 hours seems to be the longest that I can have an individual fast for on a weekly basis without most people incurring some metabolic downregulation. That's the key, because you probably heard of Dana White, right? Owner, is he the owner of UFC or is he the CEO?
He's the owner.
He's the owner. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So Dana White did a 5-day fast, got really lean, and he's been touting the amazing benefits of fasting. And there's been a lot of pro and con reactions to that. But then it's really confusing, because then it makes people think, oh, I'm going to go do a 5-day fast to get shredded because he got lean. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that. Mm-hmm. Anything beyond 4 days at a time creates massive metabolic downregulation in your metabolism. Now, you will get lean, but I guarantee he had some fat loss that he gained on his body afterwards. Not to mention, for most people, they need more than one singular 5-day fast to get lean. And if they start doing that more often, they're going to crash really hard, really fast. So 2 days seems to be, and mind you, there's no data. There's no literature I can quote for you. This is my 20 years experience, both on myself and 10 years in a clinical setting working with patients. But what I have found is 48 hours for most people, we can take advantage of that huge improvement that 48-hour fast does. And I know we're going to get into all that here in a bit, but it gives us 5 more days afterwards to consume adequate calories and protein and kind of prevent that metabolic downregulation from happening. So there's a sweet spot, if you will. And I think that's what I figured out with the flow protocol.
Right. And when we're talking about now the specific prolonged fasting, when someone listens to a 24-hour fast, a 20-hour fast, a 30-hour fast, as opposed to a 16-8, all they hear is a difference in calories and when I'm consuming calories. But what about the physiological changes that come with a prolonged fast that lead to all these long-term positive outcomes that you don't see with intermittent fasting? And I guess this is probably a great time to point out that we do, though lack clinical studies, time and time again over the course of the years, reviewing these labs, and very robust ones at that, and seeing changes in their CRP, in their inflammation, in their metabolic panels, their A1C and blood glucose, in their lipid panels. I mean, it seems like whenever you get someone into fasting, it almost has to cause a positive change in the markers in their labs. But why is that?
Great question. And we should have brought this up for our last podcast where we talked about problems with the healthcare, but something flashed in my mind and I didn't want to not say something, but research is very expensive. And, it's unfortunate how this works against us, because We obviously need research. It's the reason why human beings have advanced the way they have, and they will continue to advance due to the benefits of research. And research is broken down to many different categories, from low end anecdotal to human randomized control studies, and then even the meta analysis of all that. So once we get to that higher level that we need to draw powerful conclusions, it's extremely expensive. And so we're, by definition of the model itself, this is why I always tell people it's David versus Goliath when you're trying to have a discussion regarding holistic therapies or versus allopathic drugs and surgery. There's always going to be significantly heavier amount of data to support those research studies, and it's not even a fair conversation or discussion if you're unwilling to consider that as a variable itself and have a fair conversation. Right. So that's one piece. You need a financial, there has to be a financial, what's the best word is, there has to be some profit to be made by some private company in order for them to be able to put the money up front, because nobody thinks about this, right? But these medications, GLP-1 medications, semaglutide or tirzepatide, for example, which I'm a big fan of, there were billions of dollars spent by the pharmaceutical companies as an investment up front before they made any profit in return on their investment. What kind of company has that kind of cash flow to be able to put up that much money in hopes that they can get it approved and put it to market and make money? So this is the reality of the scene. This is why many holistic therapies never get the attention they need. And then outside of treatment modalities, then we talk about lifestyle interventions. Even if we did have somebody with money that wants to do this, it would be a really poor business move. Like, there's no business you can make off of researching fasting. So it would literally have to be somebody willing to put up billions of dollars out of the kindness of their heart, out of the goodness that they want but out of the good that they want to do for humanity. Or better yet, our government would have to say, hey, you know what? Let's do a study for the benefit of humanity. But anyways, we should get into that more in our part 2 of that problems with healthcare series we're doing. Maybe that's going to be a series.
It might be.
But I really do, the more we unravel this. But yeah, fasting, unfortunately, the research is very slow to move. But it's moving, it's progressing. I just wanted to cover that. So getting back to prolonged fasting, it's an extension, a significant extension of what intermittent fasting does. So let's break down the benefits. There's so many. We're not going to cover them all. I want to cover the main ones. So when we look at our hormones, right? Because my whole argument for why it's necessary, one of the main pieces is that the hormonal basis of obesity, the insulin carbohydrate theory, is very real, and answers a lot of questions. And so the effects that prolonged fasting has to lower our insulin levels is massive, right? So we think about insulin itself. It's the hormone that's responsible for driving blood sugar out of our blood into our cells, right into our body. So when we eat food or we have stress response, our insulin levels rise. But outside of what we eat and maybe some stress in our life, you could also have insulin levels elevated because of a condition known as insulin resistance. And so insulin resistance exists, and there's many theories as to where the resistance develops from. And, we can save that for another episode. But essentially, one popular theory is chronically elevated insulin levels, right? So you have a period of time in your life where you are eating the foods that cause higher levels of insulin, coupled with stress, coupled with inflammation, and you end up developing a resistance to insulin. Now, once that resistance develops, you then have insulin that is now higher, independent of just the food that you eat. And that's the problem right there, chronically elevated insulin levels. So it's an unfortunate point in a person's health regression where it's no longer just the food that's spiking their insulin levels up. So they can make these dietary changes and they're not going to really move the needle. They're not going to have as easy of a time lowering their insulin levels because of the resistance. So, and research is still trying to figure out how to reverse insulin resistance. Like a lot of these things that we do in our space, it's not, nothing's really proven yet. But if you think about the mechanisms behind what developed the resistance to begin with, it becomes very clear to you that Well, we just need to do the opposite. What's the fastest ways to lower our insulin levels? Well, we just said it comes from how we eat, specifically carbohydrates, a little bit from protein, and almost nothing from fat. And then also the frequency too. So if we can decrease the frequency and we can decrease the consumption of carbohydrates, we're going to have we're not going to have this response from causing our body to increase insulin. And if we do that over a long enough period of time, then maybe the resistance can start to heal, because the resistance has been trying to heal the entire time. Your body is always trying to heal, but it's met with barriers from within your body. So what is the absence of eating? It's fasting. And what is the longer form of fasting? Prolonged fasting. And what's the world's best and most aggressive format of prolonged fasting? I might be a little biased as the inventor, but I think it's the flow protocol. So truthfully, when it comes to addressing that carbohydrate insulin theory, this is the powerful hormonal response we get from longer rounds of fasting. And we just don't get that from intermittent much at all. Now, other powerful hormonal improvements outside of insulin, then we look at the effects on muscle mass. So a lot of people think that you're going to lose all sorts of muscle mass when you start prolonged fasting. And it's just not true. So calorie deficits, AKA weight loss, because we already have the data knowing that when you lose weight, you will lose a certain amount of muscle mass. We know that. And the game becomes, how can I reduce the percentage of total weight loss as muscle loss? How can I maximize fat loss, minimize muscle mass loss? Well, adequate protein consumption and solid resistance training. But the third variable is your hormones. Simply look at a man that's on testosterone therapy versus not, or woman, and they do the exact same thing in their diet. The person with increased testosterone levels is going to have significantly better muscle mass retention than they would otherwise. So we know the influence of hormones specifically in a category like this. And, I'm not even trying to say that fasting is going to increase testosterone. I just want to give a good example. But there are other powerful hormones that get improved when you get into longer rounds of fasting. The first one is growth hormone. And growth hormone has on its own so many benefits. But specifically, it will either improve muscle growth if you're in a caloric surplus, or minimize that loss that we talked about, just like very similar to testosterone, although it's got its own unique pathways. It will increase fat loss, improve quality of sleep, a lot of great things. So you have an increase in growth hormone levels naturally from long fasting, which is protective against muscle mass. And then you have this increase in catecholamines. So catecholamines are your fight or flight hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, noradrenaline. And these are, they do a lot of different things in the body, right? So attentiveness, alertness, better mobilization of fat, protection of muscle mass. And it makes sense, right? Because you think about an animal, for example, that hasn't eaten for several days, it would be very silly, and they wouldn't survive if after a day or two of not eating, they were collapsed and tired and lethargic, and which is not the case. We see them, they're very heightened and hyper focused, ready to hunt. It was the same thing with our ancestors. Certainly it is stressful. You don't want to stay there forever, because that's a heightened sense, right? It is a bit of it's called fight or flight hormones. So we're certainly not saying to stay there, which is why I always advocate the 48 hours per week. As soon as you get near your weight loss goal, you decrease that frequency. But while those fight or flight, those catecholamines are increased, you are going to have better muscle retention, better fat loss. And then finally, ketone bodies, right? This whole concept of becoming metabolically flexible, which is what regular rounds of long fasting does, but you improve metabolic flexibility, and your body starts producing ketone bodies easier. So what do I mean by that, right? You have to be in a low carb state for your body to start producing ketone bodies, or you just become very metabolically flexible. The more metabolically fit you become, the quicker your body can dive into this production of ketone bodies. So from the beginning, for most people, their body will not produce any ketone bodies until they deplete all of their stored carbohydrates. We call that glycogen. You have to literally deplete all that. Once you deplete all that, then your body is forced to produce ketone bodies. Well, after months of living this lifestyle and following this protocol, especially if you're resistance training, because when you're resistance training, which is an example of high intensity exercise, which demands a glycolytic support system that you can't fuel with ketone bodies for weightlifting. You can, but it's not going to be as effective, right? So your body prefers to burn carbs. And so you can actually train your body to literally sort of preserve the muscle glycogen in anticipation for the next workout and tap into fat stores faster, right? Sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I would imagine this metabolic fitness. This is what we see in people, and is probably the answer to the question: how come Jane can eat whatever the hell she wants and she seems to stay fit, and Bob over there looks at a muffin and he blows up, right? Why is the calorie more or less the same, the caloric intake, and we account for the differences in what we would expect to see because height, weight, and gender, yet there's just a massively different response person to person. And I think the difference in things like metabolic flexibility are exactly why we see such a variance.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the catecholamines, we have massive improvements to insulin resistance, improvements to metabolic flexibility. Two more systems that I think are really worth noting: inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
Inflammation is not a hormone, but inflammation is a big deal. In fact, for me, for what I've seen over the past 20 years, insulin resistance is the number one thing to focus on. So if I have 100 people and you ask me what's the one thing that you can help them on, that's going to get the most amount of people out of their weight loss issues, insulin resistance. And then if you ask me what's the second most common thing that if you were to focus on would probably help the most amount of people, it'd probably be inflammation. Lowering inflammation levels, because excessive levels of inflammation, chronic inflammation, will have in its own pathways, completely different pathways, but have this similar effect that insulin does when elevated, which is blocking. It's a signal that blocks that mobilization of fat, that utilization of free fatty acids, and it's a signal to put the body into more fat storage mode. So we gotta address inflammation, and long fasting lowers inflammation levels, and that's very well documented.
Mm-hmm.
That has a lot to do with that process called cellular autophagy, which is this self-renewing, self-recycling process, which is awesome, where your body repairs itself on a cellular level in response to the absence of consumption of amino acids. And so that's a beautiful regenerative process that we get out of fasting, longer fasting, in addition to the lower inflammation. And then finally, cortisol. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and cortisol levels are impacted from long rounds of fasting. So this is where we get into the potential risks, I would say, things that need to be understood. So I'll kind of separate that, because I know you had a couple other questions that you wanted to ask me regarding some of the concerns over fasting. But as far as well documented and established improvements, I would say there's significantly more, but those really are the main ones.
Quick minute here. I wanted to tell you guys about my free resources to help you guys with your sustainable weight loss goals. I have a free Facebook community where I do weekly live coaching. It's all about helping you hit your goals and maintain your weight for the rest of your life. And I also have a free PDF where I break down step by step exactly what it takes for you to be successful. I'll put a link to this in the show, and we'll see you guys back in the show.
Good. And just really quick to highlight the autophagy, because of all the topics discussed when debating prolonged fasting, I feel like autophagy gets touched on the least. And last week I was reading Dr. Walter Longer. He's a cellular biologist, biogerontologist, and he wrote a book called, and I know we got a tiptoe here, Fasting Cancer. Dr. Berg has no problem talking about this, but he cites, and this is a guy who's done over 20 clinical studies himself. And he talks about specifically pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, and other forms that he's saying are being prevented, and more so, from what he says, reversed through prolonged fasting, through starving cancer, through autophagy and cellular regeneration. What do you think the future prospects hold regarding the potential positive medical implications long term?
Well, do I think it's ever going to become mainstream as a treatment of cancer? Hell no. Yeah. Oh man. I mean, I think there are probably many other things that we can hope for. That would be representative of movements in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
But do I think if I had cancer or any of my loved ones had cancer, you better believe they'd be fasting and they'd be prolonged fast. They'd be doing the flow protocol, truthfully, with occasional long fasting done probably on a bi-quarterly, maybe or bi-monthly basis, actually. So I think that I don't need the human randomized control studies proving that long rounds of fasting is beneficial for cancer. Like I know how safe it is. And when I look at the mechanisms, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because we have this very, very complex, and I'm not even going to begin to get into cancer or tout myself as a cancer expert. I'm not an oncologist or anything like that, but understanding on some level, the mechanisms of cancer, we have an uncontrolled growth, right? Some cancers are driven by this mTOR process, which is a important process, even in muscular growth too, as well, right? So growth versus controlled growth versus uncontrolled growth is still categorized as a growth process. Well, what is fasting? Fasting is a breakdown process. Fasting, your body literally, when we get into cellular autophagy, by definition, your body is scavenging for non-essential tissues because you haven't consumed amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of the body. And so your body is always in a process of it's like a balance between breakdown and rebuilding. So you're in a balance, and they sometimes refer to that as your nitrogen balance. Are you in a positive nitrogen balance? Are you in a negative nitrogen balance? That's how they can measure if you're growing or if you are like building muscle, for example, or if you're breaking down because you're losing weight. You'd be in a negative nitrogen balance. So fasting is a very intelligent process, because think about this. The body somehow knows to not break down any organ tissue during a fast. It won't touch organ tissue. It somehow has an intelligence in itself to know which tissues are essential to not touch and which tissues are non-essential. And it breaks down those tissues, those cells, to recycle them and utilize those broken down parts, which end up being recycled to more amino acids to replace the lack of consumption. And then at the end of the fast, that's when the body can get into a healthy growth response. But I mean, to me, giving your body like a balance between growth and a balance between breakdown. This is why I'm such an advocate when it comes to the use of growth hormone peptides to incorporate fasting into your lifestyle, because growth hormone, if you're already at the point in your health, which is wherever you may particularly be, let's say you happen to be an individual who's not the most healthy, and you're teetering in more of a growth process, maybe you're closer to the start of cancer, and then you go throw on some growth hormone peptides. Well, that sounds a little concerning to me. So fasting is just a great way to balance it out and give your body some breakdown that I think would be part and parcel with a healthy lifestyle that would potentially prevent the development of some sort of cancer.
Yeah, man, that's some really good stuff. And looking at fasting as a whole, especially prolonged, there does seem to be a lot of overlap between prolonged fasting and keto, which I also know you're a huge proponent of, especially when it comes to even starting and breaking the fasts themselves. So let's transition a little bit into that. We now understand the benefits and potential benefits um, of prolonged fasting on a physiological level. So where does keto fit into all this?
So yeah, there's some similarities between keto. The biggest similarity between, in terms of benefits, between keto and long fasting is the absence of insulin secretion. So the benefit of doing all these things is to lower insulin levels, to lower those chronically elevated insulin levels by not doing the things that trigger insulin release, which is somewhat protein consumption and highly dependent upon carbohydrate consumption, and even more pushed by sugar, which is a type of carbohydrate, or processed refined carbohydrates. So that'd be the worst of the carb category. So when you go on a ketogenic diet, you get some. So some people think that you're completely devoid of insulin. No, you have some from fat, just very, very, very low, very negligible. And so this is why some people have referred to ketogenic diets as a fasting mimicking diet, because of the similarity right there. But cellular autophagy, though, that's where, to me, that's like the second most important thing with longer fasting. You have to be in that near zero energy consumption to really trigger maximal cellular autophagy. You know, we don't know for sure because we haven't done the studies that would be needed to know for sure. But I think it's pretty clear and evident at this point that the more calories we consume, the farther from zero on a maybe a 24-hour rhythm, if we're fasting, the decreased amount of cellular autophagy we're going to have. So right away, what I'm saying is longer rounds of fasting gives you a better reaction in terms of the absence of insulin, and it gives you the cellular autophagy response. So this is, and we've seen this with patients, like 48-hour fasting per week, even if you didn't do keto on the other 5 days, I think would give an individual a much faster healing and lowering of insulin levels than no fasting, or maybe even intermittent fasting, but no long fasting paired with a low carb diet. So, you know, and I think there's just, again, too many unknowns. This stuff hasn't been studied yet to compare head to head. So this is why for us and our patients, we just make them do both. We go, look, you're obese, you're sick, like and I have just the outcomes that we're seeing are amazing. I just had a video, a coaching call with a patient yesterday. You know, it was a 2-month check-in. Really, for her, I think it was 3 months. 10 years of her A1C not being able to budge. 10 years. And she left us a review, by the way, but her A1C finally started moving in the right direction, and her doctors are blown away. And the same doctor told her, yeah, keep doing what you're doing, but I don't want you to do as much of the prolonged fasting. And I'm sitting there talking to this patient because, you know, I always look, I'm a doctor of chiropractic. I'm very clear with that. You know, I function as a health coach, and I go, well, look, I can't give you that medical advice, but what do you think is the thing that we did that really moved the needle? She's like, the long fasting. I was like, okay, so what do you think you need to do moving forward if you want to, because her goal is to beat the diabetes. It's like, do you think if you stop the prolonged fasting that you're going to continue to make the progress and beating it? She's like, no. So, you know, I explained to her, I was like, if I were you, I'd have a conversation with your doctor and your primary care and let them know, like, this is your goal. You know, I think these doctors are so reluctant to tell people the difference between don't do that versus, well, here's why I don't think you should do that because my concerns and blah, 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 blah. See, that communication is gone. It's like these practitioners are treating their patients like 5-year-olds, and they're just skipping the whole part of like, well, here's why I'm telling you, and sounding so negative because blah, 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 blah. And they're just telling them, don't do that. And, you know, that gets into another problem with healthcare that we didn't talk about is, and that's under the insurance company category, which is the short amount of time that these poor clinicians have to see these patients. They don't have time to have these types of conversations. And so it's the reality of the situation. So anyways, bringing it back to keto. So we get a lot of the benefits that fasting gives you. It's just fasting gives you faster, no pun intended, benefit. I think the sweet spot though is doing both for a couple months, depending on how sick you are, and then we can phase off of the keto, because the reality is that's the other problem with keto is not sustainable.
Right.
If anybody knows Peter Attia listening to this, he is a well-versed anti-aging medical doctor, and he went keto for 3 years. I've done it for like 6 months. He did it for 3 years, and he said that he broke it at a wedding, and he had about 9 pieces of birthday cake. I went through a similar binge myself on carbohydrates, and I've discussed, over the last 20 years, hundreds of people. And I know you probably can tell me the same thing, John, with your experience back managing gyms and all those trainers. Like, it's the best analogy for what it's like to eat a piece of carbohydrate, almost as a piece of bread, piece of whatever it is, after truly restricting it for 3 months or more. And 3 months is arbitrary. It'd probably be like doing something crazy like cocaine, or the addictiveness of a drug like that, because I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop. And I've heard this story from people where it lasted days, and sometimes it lasted weeks. Sometimes it didn't stop till they gained every single pound back that they lost. I've heard that plenty of times. So that's, when we talk about sugar being so addictive, you never really see people, doing the kind of things for sugar that they would for cocaine or anything like crazy like that. But man, you talk about drug-like ravenous desires. Take away carbs for more than 3 to 6 months, and then give it back, and you'll see some crazy stuff happen.
If you want an example of the chemical fireworks that get lit off when you eat sugar, watch your baby. These little kids, a year and a half, they've had peas and carrots and fruit and everything a baby can have. Yet you record them having that first bite of ice cream, and it's amazement and shock, right? Baby doesn't know what's coming, right? But that's literally the physiological reaction that humans have because of how intense those foods really are. It's really interesting to think about. When you talk about keto and you mention clean versus dirty, what do you mean there?
Yeah. So dirty keto is basically just not really thinking about anything other than just lowering your carbohydrate intake and increasing fat and or protein. And the problem when you do this is, there's so many deliciously tasting fat sources out there that tend to be high in saturated, and I'm okay with saturated, but not the majority of your fat intake, especially when you're on a ketogenic diet. I think there needs to be a balance, and not to mention a ton of trans fats too as well, which unfortunately there's just no room for trans fats, which is essentially fried foods. And so you'll get the results, you'll lose the weight, you'll feel better on a level that is acute, and I think long term, that's when you're going to run into problems, not just with your lipid panel, but with other markers too as well. So clean keto means applying the same principles that we would do in any other, at least my approach towards healthy, lasting weight loss incorporates some principles, right? Aside from the fasting, we got to reduce our consumption of processed foods. That still applies on a clean keto. Adequate protein is still applicable. But then really the most important variable is when we look at the category of fat, because a true ketogenic diet, you're going to be eating 70% of your calories, roughly 60 to 80, depending on how strict it is going to come from fat. And so that's the majority of your calories. And so fat itself can be broken down into 3 main categories: saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So I just keep it simple with our patients, and I put saturated into one category, and I put the rest into the other category, unsaturated. And we just say, look, because we're not making them count calories and macros because they don't need to, but just estimate. It's easy to spot your saturated one. That's all your animal products and coconut oil. So if it came from an animal, its fat is saturated, and there's some poly and mono, but for the most part, it's mostly saturated, and that includes coconut oil. So try to get about 1/3 ish of your fat from that, and then 2/3 from the rest. But the rest is not that big of a, it's not that big. The list is, I can list it off right now. You literally have avocados, avocado oil, olives, olive oil, nuts, small fish, salmon. I don't know if you consider salmon a small fish or not, but it's a bigger fish. And then small fish. And that's it. That's your list of, that's your choices of food that contain the unsaturated category. So, you know, we educate our patients on how to become really comfortable with that list, and really build it around their choices of food.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously we got to go into the nuances and the risks associated. But I did just think of this, as you mentioned, Tia's 3-year stint. I thought about Joe Rogan doing carnivore. Then I thought about a lot of stories I've heard about carnivore and things like PCOS, psoriasis, vitiligo, GERD. And who really, really stood out was Jordan Peterson's story. I mean, he was hit seriously hard with some pretty bad autoimmune issues, to the point where I think he almost died. And it transformed his symptoms and his life so much that even his daughter got into it. I think she does some altered version of keto with maybe veggies and trace carbs, like some low glycemic fruit. But either way, we talk about prolonged fasting, we talk about keto, and now just thinking about carnivore, which essentially it's just the removal of all carbohydrates. Why do you think, again, I'm not going to make any claims here, why do you think there are so many stories of all of these people claiming to have resolution with these dietary strategies that all essentially force your body into a fat burn?
Why do we notice so much improvements in their health?
Yeah, why are they, why are we seeing all these people saying that their healths are being improved? So again, I'm not making the claim, they are, that their healths are being improved so dramatically.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about a ketogenic diet, the primary benefit is the lowering of chronically elevated insulin levels. I mean, just hands down, that is the primary driver behind the majority of improvement. And then I would say inflammation lowering is a secondary effect, and then it trickles on down there from there. And that same thing with fasting. Those are the big two biggest improvements that happen, because we talked about how the long fasting and the ketogenic diet are achieving some of the same stuff. So those two, hands down, are the most important things that we're seeing happen.
Got it. All right. So risks and risk factors, especially among those who might have anything that's pre-existing, and also just diving into women who want to get into prolonged fasting, especially with the hormonal changes and dealing with menstrual cycles.
Yeah, I think this is great. We got about 10 minutes left here, so I think we can wrap it up here real quick. Though I thought I heard, and maybe I'm mistaken, I thought it was Jordan Peterson's daughter that got him into the carnivore diet, not the other way around.
You know what? You're right. He was struggling. She had done it. She felt better. He did carnivore, and that's when everything changed. I think he actually reintroduced fruits for a bit and had some of the symptoms return. So he's like, nope, let me just go straight carnivore.
Yeah, that's what I. Yeah, he's not doing it. He's not getting at the massive improvement that his daughter's getting. His daughter needs it based off of, but he was still moved with the changes he got. Anyways, yeah, I thought that was real. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so great, and I think this is a great way to end it, because as safe as it is, we do need to understand some potential issues. And so it starts with cortisol. So fasting is a stressor. So longer fasting, flow fasting, is a bigger stressor, right? Stress can destroy our health, but not all stress is bad. And so it's important to understand that eustress is what we call good stress, right? Preparing for a challenge and then accomplishing it, overcoming that challenge, and the process through it can be stressful in the moment, but you're hitting that goal and you're winning. That's all great stress. Weightlifting is a literal breakdown microscopically. You can see you're tearing down your tissue. When would you ever think that tearing down tissue is a good thing? It's a phenomenal thing when done in a controlled fashion known as weightlifting, because of the stress response. And I think it was Dr. David Sinclair that talks about human beings, we need stress. We need use stress. The human body was meant to cope down to our genetic code, and the lack of stress, this positive use stress that gives our body this tolerance to be able to cope with it and deal with it, the backwards steps that we make in our health. So I really do think that human beings not only flourish with use stress, but we need it. We need it. So long fasting is a challenge to our metabolic system specifically. That's the stressor. So weightlifting, challenging the muscles. Long fasting is challenging our metabolic systems, specifically energy providing systems, right? Because your body needs, on average, human beings, depending on your height, weight, and all that, need about, we could say on average, 2,000 calories a day. 2,000 calories a day is our energy requirements. And so if you're not consuming 2,000, right, before you get any sort of metabolic downregulation, your body has to pull that energy from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so the goal, the idea is it pulls it from fat. But when your body hasn't developed that metabolic flexibility that we talked about earlier, that's the stressor of fasting, right? It's your brain, specifically tiny area in your body, consumes about 25% of your glucose requirements, is freaking out when it doesn't get that steady supply of glucose. And this is where we see all these various symptoms manifest, generally tiredness and brain fog, but sometimes some emotional disturbances can happen too as well. And so the greater the inability for your body to meet those energy demands, the greater the stress response. And that stress response is cortisol. So again, cortisol is part of the stress response, and in controlled manners is okay. Excessive amounts of cortisol is in the wrong times is what can be problematic. So I bring that up so that we can understand a little bit of that stress response and how it's perpetuated by fasting, which is okay for most people. But when is it not okay? Mm-hmm. Well, I think before we get to women, the other category would just be extremely sick people, because there is no given condition. So I have had individuals that are just so far gone that I cannot get them into fasting. It's pretty rare, believe it or not. And I think it's because we use like really powerful peptides like AOD to mobilize body fat. But nonetheless, I've had some patients where they're so sick that they can't even tolerate the stress of even intermittent fasting. Mm-hmm. And if that happens, it's like, okay, guess what? Let's start with keto. Let's go keto for a couple months. Let's reduce your inflammation levels. Let's improve your health in other areas. All this means, if you can't tolerate the fasting, is we just need to figure out, we need to lower the gradient. And maybe fasting entirely, your body's just not ready for that. So keto is a good segue, but it's pretty rare. And I deal with obese patients, and it's even obese patients, we can get them into fasting, but that's the caveat there. Some severe flared up autoimmune patients, if they come to us in a flare up, okay, then maybe starting a fasting, maybe we need to kind of work them into it, reduce inflammation levels, try to turn down that flare up. But that's really one kind of ambiguous category. And then we get into diabetics, and then we'll talk about women, and then we'll be done for today. So for diabetics, specifically being on diabetic lowering medications would be my first sort of area for concern, because long fasting is going to lower your blood sugar levels. For an individual that's not diabetic, even if you are diabetic and pre-diabetic, your body still is going to do everything it can to prevent the blood sugars from actually dropping into a concerning level. We would call that medical grade hypoglycemia, right? I've had plenty of diabetics that are not on meds, and they're completely fine, because when they're not on meds, their blood sugar is higher. So they're fine. The fasting just gets their blood sugar down to fasting acts like the medication. So a diabetic off meds needs the fasting to act like the med. So it's usually not an issue. But and then the healthy individual whose blood sugar isn't high doesn't have dysregulation to begin with. So their bodies can fight that absence of eating and raise the blood sugar. But when you get to a diabetic on diabetic lowering medications, and let's say, for example, maybe they're a little overprescribed. Maybe one day they took more than they needed, right? So if you're on a higher amount of diabetic lowering medications and you go on a long fast, that's where we start entering this category of potential concern. And I'll tell you, metformin, I haven't seen much of an issue. It's really when we start getting beyond metformin, we start getting to, say, sulfonylureas, for example, especially when they're on insulin. That absolutely, when like we kind of stay away from that in our clinic, in our practice, insulin dependent diabetics. This is the way out, but unfortunately it does require some strict medical supervision. Go fly to Canada and spend some time at Dr. Fung's, Jason Fung, the author of Obesity Code and Diabetes Code. He's out there fixing diabetes under medical supervision, which I think is great. Being on insulin, I think, is probably or a couple of medications of diabetes, I think, is definitely more concerning, and one needs to be very careful and have conversations with their primary care physicians. Everybody should have discussions with their primary care physicians when starting a fasting program. But I think the ones that really should, that have the biggest concern, would be the on diabetic lowering medications. So segueing to women. So women have a different hormonal pattern than men. Men have a 24-hour rhythm, and women have a 28-day, which is pretty crazy, right? Like, yeah, every 24 hours, a man repeats the same pattern, but women, it's every 28 days. So if you were to visualize, there is a release, an increase in certain hormones. So for women, the big sex hormones we're talking about are estrogen, progesterone, but they also have testosterone too as well. And so day 13 to 15 for a woman is ovulation. And so those 3 days, there can be some sensitivity to fasting. But the bigger window for concern is they call it the progesterone phase, which is the pre-cycle, the pre-bleed for women, day 18 to 28. And so during that progesterone phase specifically, this is where women have to produce progesterone. And anything that disrupts the production of progesterone creates issues for them, which manifests as menstrual symptoms. And so for a lot of women, if they're just flat out doing fasting, they go beyond intermittent, that's where this issue can arise. And Dr. Mindy Pelz really, discusses this a lot. But again, that issue is because cortisol is released from the long fasting, and cortisol will actually rob and block that, because it's a precursor toward the production of progesterone. So if cortisol is being produced, it's interfering with the production of progesterone. Yet, and Mindy talks about this, Dr. Pelz, as being a very common issue for all women. Yet over my probably 8 years now, we've been using AOD. So AOD is a powerful fat mobilizing peptide. And I noticed significantly lower percentage of women having issues. And so there's for this topic, there's no data on this. So I can only theorize, but I'm pretty confident that since the AOD is mobilizing the body fat, that's why I've always called AOD as artificially induced metabolic flexibility. And you can get the same effect from any growth hormone secretagogue. So samorelin, tesamorelin will work too as well. But improving metabolic flexibility and mobilization of fat would then make the long fast less stressful for the body, which means less cortisol, which means less robbing of progesterone. So I think that's really cool. And I'd love to consult and work with Dr. Mindy Pelz one day regarding this, because I'd love her intake on this and her insight. But I can only attest to what we've seen. And yeah, if you can get access to this as a woman, one of these peptides, you're going to have an easier time getting into longer fasting, which we know longer fasting is absolutely amazing for all the reasons we've discussed thus far.
All right. And then for someone who just watched this and they have a typical American diet, they're about to hit stop. Yeah, we're in 1992 with the VCR. They're going to hit their phone or whatever it is, right? Their phone's going to go black, or their computer screen's going to time out. What's the first step? Do I do a fast tomorrow for 8 hours for 16? Do I jump right into a 24 feet first? Do I reanalyze what's in my refrigerator and my cabinet? What do I do?
Right. So I know we're out of time, so I'm gonna briefly say, do what feels right to you. And I say this because there is no right way or wrong way to start fasting. The logical idea is start with the small fasting, the shorter fasting, the intermittent. And this is why I have 3 stages. Most people are going to want to follow the logical pathway. Intermittent fasting, get really comfortable with that, work into the 24-hour fasting, which is stage 2, get comfortable with that, and then work your way into the longer fasting, utilizing as many helpful options along the process, GLP-1 medications, peptides, supplements, coaching, support, mindset training, all of that. But you also got to consider the individual. So some people just, are you a rip the Band-Aid off kind of person, or do you like to slowly peel it off? And you need to do what feels best to you. Because if you tell an individual who loves to just dive right in head first, and that's what they love to do, to not do that and peel off the Band-Aid, well, that's going to create stress and frustration. Yeah. And if you try to make a person who's a peel a Band-Aid off kind of person, you tell them, I want you to fast for 48 hours, you'll be fine. Their head's going to explode. You know, like, they're just not going to do it. So because there's no right way or wrong way, you know, the answer is do what feels right for you. And if you are going to dive in, which is less, just a lower percentage, and I love it. I love the enthusiasm. If you're feeling froggy, then leap. Understand that you are going to run into a barrier. As long as you understand that, you don't freak out, right? Did you really think you were going to fast for 48 hours? I love the enthusiasm. Some of you will, most of you won't. So just understand that. But you're going to do a lot longer when you strive for 48 than you will when you only strive for intermittent. And that's why I don't want to inhibit anybody who's a froggy kind of person from going for it, because some of you will succeed, many of you won't, but you're still going to do freaking great. And then you just continue to push yourself. You continue to push yourself and progress yourself. But that's basically it. You just need to dive in and don't look back.
I thought you were taking the easy way out and giving me the politician's answer, but that was actually refreshingly direct and well thought out. It makes a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons. As always, man, I love doing this.
Yes, sir. Until next time.
Talk to you soon.
If you guys found this informative, then you're going to want to click this video right there. It's a continued explanation of what you learned today, guys. Knowledge is power, so let's keep this going. We'll see you later.